If you close your eyes and summon the image of a haunted house, you are almost certainly imagining Lyndhurst. You see the jagged, skeletal silhouette cutting against a moonlit sky. You see the sharp, lance-like windows that peer out like narrowing eyes. You see the limestone turning cold and grey in the rain, and the turrets that look less like a home and more like a warning. This is not a coincidence. This house, perched on a wind-swept bluff overlooking the Hudson River in Tarrytown, New York, didn't just adopt the Gothic style. It defined the American nightmare. It is the architectural grandfather of every spooky mansion in cinema history, from the ominous home of dark shadows to the Victorian frights of Hollywood horror. But before it was a movie set, before it was a museum, and before it was a national trust site, it was a mistake. Or at least, that is what the neighbors called it. To understand the sheer shock value of this building, you have to mentally erase the modern context of eclectic architecture. You have to go back to 1838. In the late 1830s, the American elite were obsessed with a very specific, very rigid aesthetic, the Greek Revival. If you were a man of wealth and taste in New York, you built a white box. You built a temple. You erected massive, pristine white columns that mimicked the Parthenon. It was an architectural language that spoke of democracy, rationality, logic, and order. It was the architecture of the age of reason. A wealthy man's home was supposed to say, "I am civilized. I am rational. I am a citizen of a republic." Then came Lyndhurst. It wasn't white. It was a bruising, stormy grey. It wasn't symmetrical. It was chaotic. It rose out of the landscape like a calcified bone, a sharp, brooding rejection of everything polite society stood for. It looked like a cathedral built for a religion that no one practiced anymore. It was asymmetrical, sprawling, and seemingly ancient from the moment the last stone was set. To the refined eyes of the New York aristocracy, it looked alien. It looked aggressive. It was a house that didn't just sit on the land. It seemed to grow out of it, dark and twisted. To understand why this house exists, and why it eventually became the home of the most hated man in American history, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a time when the Hudson Valley was not a commuter suburb, but a wilderness of legends, ghosts, and folly. This is the story of how a retired general and a visionary architect conspired to bring the Middle Ages to 19th century New York. The man with the checkbook was William Paulding, Jr. On paper, he was the last person you would expect to build a castle of dark romance. Paulding was a creature of the establishment. He was a former two-term mayor of New York City, a congressman, and a brigadier general in the War of 1812. He was a man of rules, statutes, and military discipline. He came from a family of intense patriotism. His brother was one of the captors of the British spy Major John André during the Revolutionary War. The Pauldings were practical, serious people. But by 1838, William Paulding was tired. The city of New York was exploding. It was becoming a loud, grimy, industrial engine of commerce. The noise was deafening, the air was thick with coal smoke, and the politics were vicious. Paulding wanted out. He didn't just want a vacation home. He wanted a retreat. He wanted to escape the relentless progress of the 19th century and retire into the pages of a romance novel. He chose a spot in Tarrytown, just 25 miles north of the city, but culturally, it was a world away. This was Washington Irving country. This was the land of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, a place where the mist hung low over the river, where the Dutch legends of headless horsemen and goblin creatures still lingered in the valleys. It was a landscape that demanded drama. A square white box with Greek columns would have looked ridiculous here. Paulding didn't want a farmhouse. He wanted a structure that matched the emotional intensity of the river. However, Paulding knew he couldn't design this himself. He needed a partner. He needed someone who could translate his desire for escape into stone and mortar. He found his man in Alexander Jackson Davis. If Paulding was the wallet, Davis was the wizard. Davis is arguably the most important American architect you've never heard of. In the 1830s, he was a radical. While other architects were obsessively copying the Greeks and Romans, Davis was championing a new philosophy called the picturesque. The picturesque was a rebellion against the grid. Davis believed that a house shouldn't be a box that you live in, it should be a machine for emotion. He believed that as you walked around a building, the shape should change. It should surprise you. A tower here, a hidden porch there, a chimney rising unexpectedly. He wanted architecture to interact with nature, not dominate it. He didn't want the house to look built. He wanted it to look like it had been discovered. When Paulding approached Davis, he didn't ask for a mansion. He asked for a villa. In the architectural language of the time, a mansion was a showpiece for the city, but a villa was a place of intellectual retreat. It was supposed to be a place where a gentleman could read poetry, look at the river, and contemplate the sublime. But what Davis sketched on paper was unlike any villa in America. It was a low, sprawling Gothic fantasy, filled with turrets, crenellations, and vaulted ceilings. They called it the Knoll. The construction of the Knoll began in 1838, and from the very first day, it was a project defined by its materials. Davis and Paulding made a critical decision that would define the soul of the house forever. They refused to use wood or brick for the exterior. They wanted stone, but not just any stone. They chose Sing marble. Just a few miles up the Hudson River lay the infamous Sing Sing prison. The prison sat on top of a massive vein of high-quality limestone. It was a hard, durable, and uniquely beautiful stone, but the way it was harvested adds a layer of grim history to the walls of Lyndhurst. The stone was quarried by the prisoners. Men in striped uniforms, shackled in chain gangs, swung sledgehammers under the brutal sun to cut the blocks that would build the general's castle. There is a heaviness to the material. This marble has a peculiar, chameleon-like quality. In the bright, direct sunlight of noon, it can look almost white, gleaming with a creamy elegance. But when the clouds roll in, or when the rain starts to fall, the stone absorbs the moisture and turns a deep, brooding charcoal grey. In the moonlight, it glows with a spectral, pale light. It is a house that changes its mood with the weather. The masonry work was incredibly complex. Because Davis had rejected the simple box shape, every corner of the house presented a challenge. There were bay windows that jutted out at odd angles. There were buttresses that had to be structurally sound while looking decorative. There were chimneys that twisted and turned. The masons had to hand-cut thousands of blocks to fit the erratic, flowing design of the architect. Inside, the level of detail was obsessive. Alexander Jackson Davis was a control freak of the highest order. He believed in the concept of a total work of art, Gesamtkunstwerk, long before the term was popularized. He didn't just design the walls, he designed everything. He realized that if Paulding brought his old federal-style furniture into this Gothic house, it would look ridiculous. You can't put a square mahogany dresser in a room with pointed arch windows. So Davis designed the furniture himself. He sketched chairs with high backs that mimicked the tracery of cathedral windows. He designed tables with legs that looked like stone columns. He designed the bookcases, the sideboards, and even the window treatments. Every inch of the interior was curated to reinforce the illusion that you were living in a medieval castle. The interior woodwork was painted to look like stone, a technique called faux finishing. The ceilings were vaulted with plaster ribs, painted to mimic the heavy masonry of a European cathedral. The light was filtered through diamond pane glass, casting long, fractured shadows across the floors. It was dark. It was moody. It was specifically designed to induce a state of melancholy. Today, we view melancholy as a negative emotion, synonymous with depression. But in the Romantic era of the 19th century, melancholy was fashionable. It was a desirable state of mind. To be melancholy meant you were deep, thoughtful, artistic, and sensitive to the passage of time. The house was a machine designed to generate this feeling. When you sat in the library, watching the grey river roll by through a narrow Gothic window, you were supposed to feel a sweet sadness. You were supposed to feel the weight of history. By 1842, the house was finished. It stood on the bluff, a completed vision of Gothic romance, and the public hated it. The reaction from the locals and the New York society set was brutal. They didn't see the romance. They saw madness. In a world of symmetrical white columns, this asymmetric grey pile looked wrong. It looked unbalanced. The whispers started in the taverns of Tarrytown and made their way down to the salons of Manhattan. They gave the house a nickname that would stick for decades: Paulding's Folly. The word folly is devastating in architecture. It implies a lack of reason. It implies a vanity project gone wrong. The neighbors whispered that the general had lost his mind. They said the house was asymmetrical because his brain was unbalanced. They laughed at the narrow windows, asking why a man would build a house with such a beautiful view and then squint at it through slits. They mocked the turrets, asking who the general was planning to shoot at. Philip Hone, a famous diarist and a former mayor of New York who knew Paulding, visited the house and wrote a scathing review in his journal. He was baffled by it. He called it an immense edifice that was grotesque and fanciful. He complained that the rooms were too dark, the layout was confusing, and the style was a bizarre affectation. "There is no accounting for taste," he wrote, essentially dismissing the entire project as a waste of good stone. But Philip Hone and the neighbors were missing the point. The confusion was the point. The house was designed to be a labyrinth. It was designed to make you feel small. When you stood in the entrance hall, with the ceiling soaring above you and the dark wood paneling pressing in, you weren't supposed to feel comfortable in the bourgeois sense. You were supposed to feel awed. You were supposed to feel like you had stepped out of 1842 and into 1442. Paulding didn't care about the critics. He loved his folly. He filled the library with books, thousands of them, and the halls with guests. He used the house exactly as intended, as a retreat. He spent his summers there, reading, walking the grounds, and ignoring the industrialization that was slowly creeping up the river. The original house, the Knoll, was actually quite modest in size compared to the Newport mansions that would come 50 years later. It was a two-story structure with a central tower, a villa in the truest sense. But it had a presence that dwarfed buildings 10 times its size. It had gravity. It sat on the landscape like a predator waiting to pounce. William Paulding died in 1854. He passed away in the house he loved, leaving his folly to his son, Philip Paulding. But the Paulding money, while substantial, was not infinite. The family held onto the estate for another decade, but the winds of history were shifting. The Civil War came and went, changing the American economy forever. The era of the old Knickerbocker families, the Pauldings, the Irvings, the Van Rensselaers, was fading. A new type of money was rising in New York. It was the Gilded Age. The scale of American wealth was about to explode into levels that William Paulding could never have imagined. The Knoll was about to be swallowed up by a new era of capital, money that was faster, louder, and dirtier than anything the old general had ever known. In 1864, the Paulding family sold the estate. The house sat on the riverbank, the grey Sing Sing marble weathering in the wind, waiting for its next master. The neighbors thought Paulding's folly was the height of eccentricity. They thought they had seen the limit of what this house could represent. They were wrong. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that this house was about to be transformed from a country villa into a palace for the merchant princes. They didn't know that the tower would rise higher, the footprint would double, and the darkness of the Gothic style would be amplified. And they certainly didn't know that decades later it would be inhabited by a man so feared, so reviled, and so powerful that he would earn the title, the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. The folly was finished, but the true legend of Lyndhurst, the story of unbelievable wealth, financial ruin, and railroad tyranny, was just beginning. The monster on the Hudson was sleeping, waiting for a master with a soul dark enough to match its stone. The year was 1864. The United States was tearing itself apart. The Civil War was raging in the South, a meat grinder of history that was destroying the old aristocracy of the plantation class. But in the North, specifically in New York City, the war was doing something else entirely. It was minting millionaires. The industrial machine required to feed, clothe, and arm the Union forces had created an economic boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. A new class of men was rising from the smoke of the factories. They were not generals, they were not philosophers, and they were not Knickerbocker royalty like the Pauldings. They were capitalists. They were the merchant princes. Into this vacuum stepped George Merritt. If William Paulding was the ghost of the past, George Merritt was the engine of the future. He was a man who had made his fortune not by inheriting land, but by inventing things. He held patents. He owned a spring company that manufactured the suspension springs for railroad cars. Every time a train rattled across the expanding American frontier, George Merritt got richer. He was the prototype of the Gilded Age tycoon, practical, ambitious, and fabulously wealthy. In 1864, Merritt was looking for a trophy. He wanted a house that signaled his arrival. He looked north to Tarrytown, to the strange, grey, asymmetrical castle sitting on the bluff. Most men of his station would have looked at Paulding S. Folly and seen a tear down. It was dark, it was weird, and it was outdated. But Merritt saw something else. He saw potential. He bought the estate, and in doing so, he saved the house from obscurity. But he didn't just want to live in the general's old villa. He wanted to conquer it. He wanted to turn the retreat into a palace. To do this, Merritt did something unprecedented in the history of architecture. Usually, when a new owner buys a custom home, they hire a new architect to stamp their own ego onto the property. They tear down wings and build over the original vision. Merritt didn't do that. He had the wisdom, or perhaps the obsession, to hire the original architect back. Alexander Jackson Davis, the genius of the picturesque, received the call. It had been nearly 25 years since he laid the first stone of the knoll. He was older now, his style had evolved, but his passion for the house hadn't faded. It is a rare thing for an artist to be given a second chance to perfect their masterpiece with a virtually unlimited budget. Merritt essentially handed Davis a blank check and said, "More." The renovation that began in 1864 was not a remodel, it was a metamorphosis. Merritt and Davis conspired to double the size of the house. But the brilliance of the expansion lies in how seamless it was. If you look at Lyndhurst today, it is almost impossible to tell where the 1838 house ends and the 1865 house begins. Davis returned to the Sing Sing quarry. He ordered the same prisoners to cut the same grey limestone. He matched the mortar joints perfectly. He extended the house to the north, creating a massive new wing that balanced the composition. But this was not just an elongation, it was an elevation. The original house was a villa, a low, brooding structure. Merritt wanted height. He wanted to dominate the skyline. So Davis designed a new tower. It rose 4 stories into the air, a jagged stone finger pointing at the heavens. It was topped with a turret that offered a commanding view of the Hudson River for miles in both directions. This tower changed the personality of the building. It went from being a quirky country home to being a fortress. It became a castle in the truest sense of the word. This era of the house represents a shift in American Gothic architecture. The early phase, Paulding's phase, was romantic and whimsical. The Merritt phase was high Victorian Gothic. It was heavier, darker, and more serious. It was the architecture of industry masquerading as the architecture of chivalry. The interiors were transformed to match the new scale. Merritt wasn't content with simple plaster. He wanted wood. He wanted the finest joinery money could buy. The new dining room became a dark cavern of opulence. Davis designed heavy, intricate tracery for the ceilings. The wainscoting was carved to look like the linen fold paneling of a Tudor manor. Stained glass was installed in almost every window, but not the religious scenes of a church. These were geometric patterns, rich in ruby reds, deep blues and golds, casting a kaleidoscope of colored light onto the parquet floors. Merritt also brought the technology of the 19th century into the medieval fantasy. He installed gas lighting, allowing the castle to glow at night like a beacon. He installed modern plumbing. He filled the house with the latest comforts, hiding the pipes and the wires behind the Gothic facade. It was a thoroughly modern machine, wearing a suit of antique armor. But George Merritt's ambition wasn't contained by the stone walls. He wanted to conquer the landscape as well. The grounds of the estate, while beautiful, were wild and swampy. Merritt viewed nature as something to be tamed, engineered, and improved. He hired Ferdinand Mangold, a German landscape architect of immense talent. Mangold didn't just plant flowers, he terraformed the earth. He drained the swamps, channeling the water into streams and ponds that looked natural but were actually carefully engineered hydraulic systems. He planted specimen trees from Europe, copper beeches, weeping hemlocks, and lindens. It was the linden trees that gave the estate its new name. The knoll sounded too small, too humble for a railroad tycoon. Merritt renamed the property Lyndhurst, after the linden trees that Mangold had planted. Over time, the name was shortened to Lyndhurst, a name that sounded ancient, British, and aristocratic. But the crowning jewel of the Merritt era wasn't the house, and it wasn't the park. It was the greenhouse. In the 1860s, orchid mania and the obsession with exotic plants were sweeping the upper classes. To have a greenhouse was a status symbol. To have a large greenhouse was a power move. Merritt decided to build the largest private greenhouse in the United States. He hired a firm called Lord and Burnham. At the time, they were a modest company. The commission at Lyndhurst would launch them into the stratosphere, making them the premier greenhouse builders in America. They would later build the glass houses at the New York Botanical Garden. The structure they built for Merritt was a cathedral of glass. It was nearly 400 feet long. It was topped with a massive, onion-shaped dome that looked like something out of the Arabian Nights or a Russian Orthodox church. It was a palace for plants. Inside, Merritt amassed a collection of palms, orchids, and ferns that rivaled the botanical gardens of Europe. Imagine the visual impact of this structure. On one side of the property stood the grey, stone, medieval castle, dark, heavy, and solid. On the other side stood this glittering, transparent, weightless fantasy of glass and iron. It was a study in contrasts. The stone represented the permanence of the past. The glass represented the fragility and brilliance of the future. The greenhouse required an army to maintain. It had its own massive coal-fired boilers to keep the tropical plants alive during the freezing New York winters. It had a staff of gardeners who did nothing but tend to the orchids. It was an exorbitant display of wealth. It said to the world, "I am so rich that I can create my own climate. I can make the tropics bloom in the snow." George Merritt lived in his castle for 9 years. He filled it with art, he filled it with family, and he filled it with the smoke of expensive cigars. He had succeeded in transforming a folly into a legitimate seat of power. The neighbors stopped laughing. You don't laugh at a man who owns a 4-story tower and a 400-foot greenhouse. The criticism of the architecture faded, replaced by a grudging respect for the sheer scale of the investment. But the house on the Hudson has a way of outliving its masters. It absorbs their energy, takes their money, and then watches them die. In 1873, George Merritt passed away. His death coincided with a national catastrophe. The Panic of 1873 struck the American economy like a tsunami. It was a financial crisis triggered by the collapse of the railroad bubble, the very industry that had made Merritt rich. Banks failed, the stock market crashed, and the country plunged into a depression known as the Long Depression. The Merritt family was left with a massive, expensive estate in the middle of an economic meltdown. The maintenance costs of Lyndhurst were astronomical. The coal bill for the greenhouse alone was enough to bankrupt a normal family. The staff of gardeners, the maids, the cooks, it was a bleeding wound on the family finances. They tried to hold on. They lived in the house for a few more years, watching their fortune dwindle as the depression dragged on. But eventually, the reality of the ledger caught up with the romance of the stone. They had to sell. But who buys a Gothic castle in the middle of a depression? Who has the cash to take on a white elephant that requires an army to run? The real estate market was dead. The grand estates of the Hudson Valley were sitting empty, gathering dust. Lyndhurst sat on the market, vulnerable once again. It needed a specific kind of buyer. It needed someone who was immune to the economic crash. It needed someone who actually profited from panic. It needed a predator. As the 1870s came to a close, the grey stone walls waited. The Merritt era of benevolent wealth was over. The house was about to enter its most infamous chapter. It was about to be bought by a man whose name was whispered with fear on Wall Street. A man who didn't just build railroads, but destroyed them for sport. A man who was looking for a place to hide from the public that hated him. The shadows in the library were about to get deeper. Jay Good was coming. By 1880, Lyndhurst was a house in search of a soul. It stood on the Hudson River bluff, its grey limestone darkened by 40 years of weather, its massive greenhouse glittering like a diamond in the rough, waiting for a master who could match its intensity. The Pauldings were gone. The Merritts were gone. The Gilded Age was entering its most ruthless phase, a time when capitalism was a blood sport and the men who played it were titans. The house needed a villain. And in Jay Goode, it found the perfect antagonist. When Jay Goode bought Lyndhurst in 1880, a collective shudder went through the polite society of New York. This was not just another rich man moving to the country. This was the arrival of a monster. To understand the gravity of this purchase, you have to understand who Jay Goode was in the American imagination. He was not a beloved industrialist like Carnegie, nor was he a begrudgingly respected oil man like Rockefeller. He was hated with a purity and intensity that is almost impossible to comprehend today. The press called him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. They caricatured him as a spider, a vampire, and a pirate. He was the architect of Black Friday in 1869, a scheme to corner the gold market that crashed the United States economy, bankrupting thousands of businesses and ruining countless lives, all so he could walk away with a profit. He was the man who waged the Erie War for control of the railroads, bribing judges and legislatures with open suitcases of cash. He was the dark prince of the robber barons, a man who believed that rules were for other people. Physically, he was shockingly unassuming. He was a tiny, fragile man, barely 5 feet tall, with a shrinking frame ravaged by tuberculosis. He had a full dark beard that hid his expression and eyes that were described as black, piercing, and bottomless. He spoke in a whisper, but when he moved his hand, Wall Street trembled. When he purchased Lyndhurst, he didn't just buy a summer home, he bought a fortress. He paid $250,000 for the estate, a massive sum in 1880, and bought it lock, stock, and barrel. He bought the furniture Alexander Jackson Davis had designed. He bought the paintings George Merritt had collected. He bought the spoons, the sheets, and the curtains. He stepped into the dead men's shoes and claimed their castle as his sanctuary. It was a perfect match. The Gothic architecture, with its brooding towers, narrow windows, and defensive posture, suited Goode's personality perfectly. It was a house that looked like it was keeping a secret. For a man who lived his entire public life under siege, constantly attacked by newspapers, prosecutors, and rivals, Lyndhurst offered the one thing he couldn't buy on Wall Street: silence. But living at Lyndhurst presented a logistical problem. Jay Goode controlled the Union Pacific Railroad, Western Union Telegraph, and the Manhattan Elevated Railway. He was the puppet master of the American economy, and he needed to be in Lower Manhattan every day to pull the strings. The commute from Tarrytown to Wall Street was roughly 25 miles. For a normal tycoon, the train would be the obvious choice. The Hudson River Railroad ran right along the edge of his property. He owned major shares in the railroads. He could have had a private car attached to any train he wanted. But Jay Goode couldn't take the train. He was the most hated man in America. If he stood on a public platform, he risked being heckled, spat upon, or assassinated. He received death threats by the bushel. He lived in constant fear of kidnapping. The train was a steel trap where he would be exposed to the public he had swindled. So Goode built the ultimate escape route. He didn't commute by land, he commuted by water. And he didn't do it in a rowboat. He commissioned the Atalanta. The Atalanta was not a boat, it was a floating palace. At 250 feet long, it was the largest and fastest steam yacht in the world at the time. It was longer than the royal yacht of the Queen of England. It was crewed by a staff of 50 sailors, engineers, and stewards who wore uniforms emblazoned with the Goode crest. Every morning during the season, Jay Goode would walk down the sloping lawn of Lyndhurst to his private dock. He would board the Atalanta, and the massive steam engines would roar to life. The yacht was designed for speed, capable of outrunning almost anything on the river. It would slice through the Hudson, bypassing the slums, the traffic, and the angry mobs, delivering Goode directly to a private slip at Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. The commute took about an hour. During that time, Good would eat a breakfast prepared by a French chef, read the telegraphs that were beamed to the ship. He owned Western Union, after all, and planned the day's financial conquests. It was the ultimate power move. While his rivals were stuck in carriage traffic or rattling on soot-filled trains, Good was gliding silently past them on a private Leviathan, untouchable and unseen. When the Atalanta passed other ships, captains would dip their flags in respect or fear. It was a symbol of his dominion. He didn't just own the rails, he owned the river. However, once the iron gates of Lyndhurst closed behind him, a strange transformation occurred. The vampire of Wall Street vanished, and a different man emerged. History is complex, and Jay Good was its most confusing paradox. The man who would ruin a bank without blinking was, by all accounts, the most gentle, loving, and devoted father of the Gilded Age. While other tycoons like Vanderbilt and Astor were known for being distant, cold, or abusive to their children, Good was obsessed with his family. He had 6 children, George, Edwin, Helen, Howard, Anna, and Frank, and he worshipped them. Lyndhurst was their playground. The neighbors, who expected orgies of excess and evil plotting, were baffled to see the terrifying Jay Good playing hide-and-seek on the lawn with his daughters. He taught them about nature. He read to them in the library. He didn't host massive, debauched parties. He was socially awkward and preferred a quiet dinner with his wife, Helen, and the kids. He suffered from terrible insomnia, a side effect of the tuberculosis and the crushing stress of his business. He would wander the halls of Lyndhurst at night, a small, ghostly figure in a dressing gown, pacing the dark corridors while the rest of the world slept. The house, with its melancholy design, became his companion. The dark wood and the stained glass absorbed his anxiety. His retreat wasn't the billiards room or the wine cellar, it was the greenhouse. The massive glass cathedral built by George Merritt became Good's church, but he wasn't interested in just looking at flowers. He became a fanatic. He amassed one of the finest collections of orchids and palms in the world. There were over 8,000 plants in the collection. Good would spend hours in the humid, glass-enclosed air, tending to the orchids himself. There is a poetic irony here. Orchids are often parasitic plants. They cling to trees and suck nutrients from the air and rain. Perhaps Good, the man accused of being a parasite on the American economy, felt a kinship with them. Or perhaps he simply loved that they were beautiful, difficult, and rare, just like the fortune he had built. He spent thousands of dollars to bring rare specimens from the Amazon and the jungles of Southeast Asia. When a rare orchid bloomed, it was an event. He would call the family into the greenhouse to stare at a single flower, marveling at its perfection. This was the duality of Jay Good, a man who could destroy a railroad on Monday and weep over the beauty of a petal on Tuesday. As the 1880s turned into the 1890s, the Mephistopheles began to fade. The tuberculosis that had plagued him for years was consuming him. He grew thinner. His eyes grew larger and darker in his pale face. He retreated further into the stone shell of Lyndhurst. He stopped going to the city as often. He spent his days on the veranda, wrapped in blankets, watching the Hudson River flow by. He watched the trains, his trains, rattling along the tracks below the bluff. He watched the commerce of the nation moving on the arteries he controlled. He was the king of Wall Street, but he was dying in a castle that was designed to look like a tomb. The public hatred never softened. Even as he lay dying, the newspapers ran articles speculating on his will and cheering his decline. They waited for the gold bug to finally be squashed. In December 1892, the end came. Jay Good died in his bed at his Fifth Avenue mansion, but his spirit was tethered to Lyndhurst. He was only 56 years old, but he looked 80. He left behind a fortune of $72 million, tens of billions in today's currency. He had won the game of capitalism, but he had lost the game of public opinion. When the news broke, the stock market rallied. The world breathed a sigh of relief that the spider was dead. But at Lyndhurst, the mood was one of genuine devastation. To his children, he wasn't a monster, he was Saint Jay. He left them everything. But he left them something else too, the burden of his name. The will was read. The fortune was divided. But the house was given to his eldest daughter, Helen. And this is where the story of Lyndhurst pivots from a tale of villainy to a tale of redemption. Jay Good had filled the house with the spoils of economic war. Now, his daughter would have to figure out how to live in a monument built by the most hated man in America. The Mephistopheles was dead. The saint was about to take over. The castle on the Hudson was about to enter its longest, strangest, and most preserved era. The gates were closed, the Atalanta was docked, and the long, quiet twilight of the Good dynasty began. When Jay Good died in 1892, the ink on the obituaries was barely dry before the vultures began to circle. New York society, the press, and the general public all turned their gaze toward Lyndhurst, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The narrative was already written in the collective mind of the Gilded Age. The robber baron was dead, and now his spoiled, soft, incompetent children would tear the fortune apart. They expected a spectacle of dissipation. They expected the millions squeezed from the railroads to be wasted on gambling, European titles, and scandalous divorces. It was the standard trajectory for the heirs of American dynasties. But Jay Good, the master strategist, had prepared for this too. He didn't leave his empire to a committee of lawyers. He left the keys to the kingdom and the keys to Lyndhurst to his eldest daughter, Helen. At 24 years old, Helen Good was an enigma. In a society that valued women for their beauty, their wit, and their ability to host a dinner party, Helen was strikingly, almost aggressively, plain. She was short, stout, and serious. She dressed in simple, severe clothes that bordered on dowdy. She had no interest in the frivolous season of Newport or the balls of Fifth Avenue. While the Vanderbilt women were dripping in diamonds and fighting for social dominance, Helen was attending law school at New York University, one of the first women to do so, just so she could understand how to manage her father's estate without being cheated by men. When she took possession of Lyndhurst, she inherited more than just a Gothic castle and a portfolio of stocks. She inherited a name that was radioactive. To the American public, good was a synonym for greed. It was a dirty word. Her father was the Mephistopheles, the devil who had wrecked the economy for sport. Helen was acutely aware of this legacy. She knew that the limestone walls of her home were built with money that many considered stolen. And so Helen Good made a silent, internal vow. She would not reject her father. She worshipped him, calling him the kindest man she ever knew. But she would launder his reputation. She would take the blood money of Wall Street and wash it clean in the waters of the Hudson. She would turn Lyndhurst from a fortress of greed into a sanctuary of redemption. The era of the saint had begun. The transformation of Lyndhurst under Helen Good was not architectural, it was spiritual. For 50 years, under Paulding Merritt and Jay Good, the house had been a place of exclusion. It was designed to keep people out. The gates were heavy iron, the walls were high, and the reputation was forbidding. Helen threw the gates open. It was a radical act that shocked her neighbors. The Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, who lived in nearby estates, maintained strict perimeters guarded by private security forces. Helen invited the public in. She invited the poor in. She looked at the cavernous rooms of the castle, rooms designed for aristocratic leisure, and saw classrooms. She founded a sewing school for the local girls of Tarrytown, many of whom were the daughters of immigrants and laborers. Every week, hundreds of young women would march up the long, winding driveway, past the intimidating guard towers, and into the manor. There, in the shadow of the Gothic arches, they were taught a trade. They were fed. They were given clothes. Helen didn't just write checks from a distance. She was there on the ground, a stern but benevolent headmistress. She turned the bowling alley, a symbol of male leisure, into a distribution center for charity. She turned the massive laundry building into a cooking school. The profit of the estate was no longer measured in railroad dividends, but in loaves of bread and stitched hems. But her most symbolic act involved the swimming pool. George Merritt had built a massive Roman-style pool house, one of the first private indoor pools in the country. It was the ultimate luxury, a private lagoon for the master of the house. Helen looked at it and decided it was too good to keep to herself. She opened it to the boys of the village. Imagine the scene in 1900. The sons of bricklayers and fishermen, shrieking and splashing in the marble-lined pool of the most hated capitalist in history, while his daughter watched from the sidelines, satisfied. It was a deliberate subversion of the class system. She was using the tools of the aristocracy to serve the proletariat. The press, which had spent decades sharpening their knives for her father, didn't know what to do with her. They couldn't hate her. Slowly, the headlines changed. The daughter of the devil became the angel of the Hudson. However, this benevolence came with a strange, psychological catch. While she opened the grounds to the world, she froze the interior of the house in time. Helen was obsessed with the memory of her father. She refused to let the 20th century touch the rooms where he had walked. In the Victorian era, mourning was an art form, but Helen took it to a pathological level. She kept Jay Good's office exactly as he had left it on the day he died. The papers were on the desk. The inkwell was full. The chair was pushed in at the exact angle. It was a mausoleum for a ghost that only she loved. She refused to update the decor. As the 1890s turned into the 1900s and then the 1910s, style changed rapidly. The heavy, dark Victorian Gothic style became hopelessly unfashionable. It was seen as gloomy, depressive, and ugly. Beaux-Arts, architecture, light, classical, French, was the new rage. Rich women all over New York were ripping out their dark wood paneling and painting everything white and gold. Helen refused. She defended the darkness of Lyndhurst with a fierce loyalty. She kept the heavy velvet drapes. She kept the dark, stained glass. She kept the faux stone walls. To change, a single chair would be to erase a part of her father. She lived in a museum of the 1880s, a woman out of time, dressed in the fashions of her youth, moving through the shadows of a house that the rest of the world considered a relic. This preservation instinct is the only reason Lyndhurst exists today. If Helen had been a slave to fashion, she would have modernized the house, destroying the Alexander Jackson Davis interiors. She would have painted over the faux marble. She would have replaced the Gothic furniture with French antiques. Instead, she unintentionally became one of the greatest preservationists in American history. She saved the house by refusing to touch it. For decades, Helen Good was the virgin queen of American society. She was the spinster aunt, the wealthy benefactor who would die alone, leaving her fortune to charity. She was 44 years old, an age that in 1913 was considered ancient for a bachelorette. The public had resigned her to a life of lonely sanctity. Then she dropped a bomb. In 1913, Helen announced her engagement. The groom was Finley Shepherd. The news hit New York like a thunderclap. Finley was not a European duke looking for a payday. He was not a ruthless tycoon like her father. He was a railroad employee, a middle manager who worked for the very system her family owned. He was handsome, he was charming, and he was significantly younger than the typical suitors of heiresses. The gossip rags went wild. Was he a gold digger? Was the saint being taken for a ride? How could the severe, pious Helen Good fall for a man who looked like a matinee idol? But the marriage was, by all accounts, a love match, and it brought a new energy to Lyndhurst. For the first time in decades, the house wasn't just a shrine to the dead. It was a home for the living. The couple couldn't have biological children, so they did something that was, again, radically ahead of their time. They adopted. They adopted 3 children, Finley Jr., Olivia and Helen, and fostered many more. Lyndhurst became a playground again. The laughter of children returned to the halls that Jay Good had paced in his insomnia. Helen, the severe matriarch, softened. There are photos of her from this era, sitting on the lawn, surrounded by dogs and children, and for the first time she looks happy. But even this happiness was tinged with the peculiar melancholy of the house. The good luck was a real concept in the public imagination, the idea that the money was cursed, that no happiness bought with it could last. The curse seemed to strike the estate itself. The great greenhouse, the cathedral of glass that was the pride of the property, had always been a fragile thing. In 1880, during Jay's time, the original wooden structure had caught fire. It was a spectacular inferno. The old wood and the dry, tropical plants created a blaze that could be seen from across the river. It burned to the ground in minutes, a pile of molten glass and twisted iron. Jay had rebuilt it in steel, bigger and stronger, but fire remained a constant threat at Lyndhurst. The house was a tinderbox of old wood and varnish. Helen lived in constant fear of losing the sanctuary. She modernized the fire suppression systems, installing hydrants and hoses. She treated the preservation of the house as a military operation. But the greatest threat to Lyndhurst wasn't fire, it was taxes. In 1913, the same year Helen married, the United States government ratified the 16th Amendment. The income tax was born. For the first time, the massive, tax-free fortunes of the Gilded Age were under attack. Then came the estate tax. The government was coming for the robber baron's hoard. Helen watched as her neighbors' estates began to crumble. The great houses of the Hudson Valley, the mansions that lined the river like a string of pearls, were being abandoned. The families couldn't afford the taxes and the upkeep. The staff was let go. The roofs leaked. The gardens went wild. One by one, the castles were sold, demolished, or turned into institutions. Helen dug in. She cut costs where she could, but she refused to let Lyndhurst fade. She reduced the staff, but she kept the core team. She stopped buying new art, but she maintained the old. She was fighting a war of attrition against the 20th century. She was determined that Lyndhurst would not become a ruin. As the roaring 20s exploded with its jazz, its flappers, and its new, reckless money, Lyndhurst stood like a stone sentinel of the past. Helen Good Shepherd became a symbol of a bygone era. She hated the new morality. She hated the short skirts and the loud music. She retreated further into her religion and her house. The sewing school continued, but the world was changing. The girls didn't want to learn to sew. They wanted to work in factories or offices. The charity model of the Lady Bountiful, handing out bread, was becoming obsolete, replaced by government welfare and social security. Helen was a benevolent queen in a world that no longer believed in queens. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had arrived. The fortune that Jay Good had built, the fortune that was supposed to last for eternity, took a massive hit. The railroads struggled. The stocks plummeted. Helen, who had given away millions to charity, found herself land rich and cash poor. She sat on the veranda of Lyndhurst, an old woman now, watching the river. The Atalanta was long gone. The private trains were gone. The greenhouses were becoming too expensive to heat. The orchids were dying one by one. The house was closing in around her. Helen Good died in 1938. The saint of the Hudson was gone. The crowds that lined the streets for her funeral were a testament to her redemption. She had succeeded in her mission. When people said the name Good in Tarrytown, they no longer thought of the devil who crashed the gold market. They thought of the woman who taught them to read, who fed them when they were hungry, and who let them swim in her pool. But she left behind a problem. She left behind a dinosaur. Lyndhurst was now a 100-year-old Gothic castle in a world of skyscrapers. It was dark, drafty, expensive, and filled with furniture that no one wanted. The will was read. The estate passed to her younger sister, Anna, the Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord. If Helen was the saint, Anna was the survivor. Anna had lived a life of international scandal, French aristocracy, and heartbreak in Paris. Now she was coming home. The saint had saved the house from spiritual ruin. Now the Duchess would have to save it from the wrecking ball. The final, and perhaps most glamorous, era of Lyndhurst was about to begin. The shadows were deep, but the diamonds were about to shine again. In 1939, as the storm clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, a ship arrived in New York Harbor carrying a passenger who was, in many ways, a living artifact of a vanished world. Anna Good, the younger sister of the saintly Helen, was coming home. But she was not returning as merely the daughter of a robber baron. She was returning as the Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord. To understand the regime change that was about to hit Lyndhurst, you have to understand the life of Anna Good. If Helen was the saint, who stayed home to wash away her father's sins with charity, Anna was the rebel who used her father's money to buy the one thing America couldn't offer: royalty. She was the ultimate dollar princess. a term used for the wealthy American heiresses of the Gilded Age who traded their industrial fortunes for European titles. And Anna had played the game harder, faster, and more scandalously than anyone else. Her story reads like a tragic opera written by a satirist. In 1895, shortly after Jay Good's death, a tiny 19-year-old Anna, described by the press as plain and sombre, married Count Boney de Castellane. Boney was the most famous dandy in Paris. He was handsome, charming, and possessed a lineage that dated back to the Crusades. He also possessed absolutely no money and a spending habit that would make a Roman emperor blush. The marriage was a transaction, pure and simple. Boney got access to the good millions, Anna got to be a countess. What followed was a spectacle of consumption that horrified even the profligate society of the Belle Epoque. Boney didn't just spend Anna's money, he incinerated it. He built the Palais Rose, the Pink Palace, on the Avenue Foch in Paris, a marble replica of the Grand Trianon at Versailles. He threw parties where he imported entire ballets from Russia. He bought racehorses, castles, and art. In just a few years, Boney de Castellane blew through $12 million of Anna's inheritance. In today's currency, that is roughly $350 million. Gone, vaporized on champagne and velvet. The American public watched this train wreck with glee. They saw it as cosmic justice. Jay Good's stolen railroad money was being wasted by a feckless French fop. But they underestimated Anna. She was her father's daughter. She was quiet, she was observant, and when she had had enough, she was ruthless. In 1906, she cut Boney off. She divorced him, a shocking act for a Catholic aristocrat in France. Boney was left penniless, forced to become an antiques dealer to survive. But Anna wasn't done. In a twist that stunned European society, she didn't retreat. She traded up. She married Boney's cousin, Haley de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Prince de Sagan, and the Duke of Talleyrand. She became a double duchess. She moved from the Pink Palace to even grander estates. She lived through World War I in France, turning her chateau into a hospital, earning the Legion of Honor. She had lived a life of unimaginable height and drama. And now, in 1939, a widow and an exile fleeing the Nazis, she was standing once again in the grey stone hall of Lyndhurst. The contrast was jarring. She had spent 40 years living in the light, airy, gold-gilded palaces of France. Now she was back in the dark, brooding, Gothic fantasy of her childhood. The saint was dead. The Duchess had arrived, and Lyndhurst was about to wake up from its slumber. When Anna took control of the estate, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Helen had run Lyndhurst like a charitable institution, a place of sewing schools and open gates. Anna ran it like a feudal court. The gates were slammed shut. The public was no longer welcome. The Angel of the Hudson vibe was replaced by the icy protocol of the ancient regime. Anna was a tiny woman, barely reaching 5 feet tall, often wearing oversized hats and heavy jewels that seemed to weigh her down. But her presence was terrifying. She brought with her a retinue of French servants who clashed instantly with the American staff. The language of the house switched from English to French. The food changed from sensible American roasts to complex sauces and aspics. She looked at the house with a critical eye. To Helen, everything Jay Good touched was sacred. To Anna, Jay Good was a fond memory, but her taste had been refined by 40 years in the most sophisticated salons of Paris. She found the dark Victorian furniture quaint but heavy. However, she didn't gut the house. She couldn't. Lyndhurst was a fortress of memory, and even the Duchess respected the shadow of her father. Instead, she began a process of layering. She started injecting French aristocracy into the American Gothic skeleton. She filled the rooms with Louis XV chairs, Sevres porcelain, and tapestries that had once hung in the Chateau of Kings. It created a bizarre, eclectic aesthetic. You would walk into a room with heavy, jagged Gothic arches, architecture designed to look like a medieval dungeon, and find it filled with delicate, gold-gilded French furniture and silk cushions. It was a visual clash of cultures. The robber baron meets the Sun King. The lifestyle she imposed was rigid. Dinner was a formal affair, served at precisely 8 o'clock, even if she was dining alone, which she often was. The table was set with the full silver service. The footmen were required to wear livery. The disconnect between the reality of 1940s America and the fantasy life inside Lyndhurst was total. Outside the gates, the world was fighting a war, rationing sugar, and listening to swing music. Inside, it was 1780, and the Duchess was waiting for the guillotine that never came. If Jay Good loved orchids and Helen loved children, Anna loved dogs, specifically Pekingese dogs. These flat-faced, yapping toy dogs became the new masters of Lyndhurst. She didn't just have one or two, she had a pack. They were given free rein of the castle. They slept on the antique velvet sofas. They ran through the dining room during meals. There is a famous, perhaps apocryphal, story that sums up the hierarchy of the house during this era. A guest once noted that the dogs were eating off silver plates. When asked about it, Anna supposedly replied that the dogs had better lineage than most of the people in New York. It was a funny quip, but it revealed a deeper truth about Anna's isolation. She had been away for 40 years. The New York she knew, the New York of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, was gone. The new society was filled with new money, ironic, given her origins and celebrities. She didn't know these people, and she didn't want to know them. She preferred the company of her dogs and her memories. She spent her days moving between the veranda and the library. She was a nocturnal creature, much like her father. She would stay up late, reading French novels, surrounded by the sleeping dogs, while the wind howled off the Hudson River, rattling the diamond-pane windows. In 1942, Anna made a decision that would flood Lyndhurst with treasure. She decided to sell the massive Good Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The house at 579 Fifth Avenue was a behemoth. It was the house Jay Good had died in, a brownstone palace that had stood as the headquarters of the family for 60 years. But the city had changed. Fifth Avenue was no longer a residential street for the ultra-rich. It was becoming a commercial district of department stores and traffic. The house was an anachronism. But you cannot just sell a house like that. You have to empty it. The contents of the Fifth Avenue mansion were legendary. It was stuffed with the plunder of the Gilded Age, paintings, sculptures, rugs, silver, and furniture. Anna organized an auction. It was the event of the season. The goods sale attracted collectors from all over the world. But before the auctioneer banged his gavel, Anna went shopping in her own inventory. She walked through the rooms of her childhood home and tagged the things she couldn't bear to part with. Truckload after truckload of treasures was sent north to Tarrytown. Lyndhurst became the lifeboat for the family legacy. Paintings by Courbet and Bouguereau, massive Persian rugs, and cases of Tiffany silver were crammed into the castle. The house, already full, became stuffed. The sheer density of objects in Lyndhurst during the Anna era was suffocating. Every surface was covered in bric-a-brac. Every wall was hung with art, sometimes 2 or 3 paintings deep. It was a hoard. It was as if she was trying to build a barricade against time using expensive objects. One specific item she brought back was a painting of her father. It was a portrait of Jay Good, looking small and dark and intense. She hung it in a place of honor. Despite her title, despite her French manners, despite the fact that she had bought her way into the oldest families of Europe, she never forgot whose money made it possible. She remained fiercely loyal to the memory of the Mephistopheles. When anyone dared to criticize her father in her presence, she would freeze them with a look that was pure good, cold, black, and terrifying. As the 1950s rolled on, Lyndhurst became a place of silence. The post-war boom was transforming America. The suburbs were encroaching on Tarrytown. The distinct, isolated estates of the Hudson Valley were being carved up for housing developments. The Tappan Zee Bridge was being built just down the river, bringing a ribbon of concrete and noise to the quiet valley. Anna ignored it all. She was in her 80s now. She was a relic, a tiny figure lost in the cavernous halls of her castle. Her children, the Duke of Talleyrand and her daughter, were grown and living their own lives in Europe. She was alone with the staff and the dogs. The maintenance of the house began to slip just slightly. The cost of labor in the 1950s was skyrocketing. You couldn't hire a staff of 40 for pennies anymore. The gardens were simplified. The great greenhouse, which had been rebuilt by Jay, was falling into disrepair again. The steel was rusting. Broken panes of glass were not replaced. The jungle inside was dying. But the house itself stood firm. The Sing Sing marble was indestructible. Anna lived in a single wing of the house, closing off the rooms she didn't use to save on heat. It is a haunting image. The Duchess of Talleyrand, one of the richest women in the world, eating her dinner on a tray in a small room, while acres of empty, silent Gothic grandeur stretched out around her in the dark. She knew the end was coming. She knew that she was the last of the line. There was no one left who wanted the house. Her children had no interest in living in a gloomy museum in New York. They were French aristocrats. The era of the great country estate was dead. No one wanted a house with 50 rooms and one bathroom per floor. No one wanted a house that cost a fortune to heat. The vultures were circling again. Developers were eyeing the land. The property was worth millions as a subdivision. They imagined tearing down the grey castle and replacing it with 200 split-level ranch homes. They licked their lips, waiting for the Duchess to die. But Anna Good had one final move to make. She had spent her life buying titles, but she knew that titles couldn't save a building. She needed an institution. She looked at the legacy of her sister, Helen, and she looked at the legacy of her father. She decided that the house was not just property, it was a document. It was a testament to a specific moment in American history that would never happen again. She began to quietly negotiate, not with a buyer, but with a guardian. She began to speak to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This was a relatively new organization dedicated to saving America's history. But they had never taken on something like Lyndhurst. They had saved the homes of patriots and presidents. Were they willing to save the home of a robber baron? Anna was betting that the sheer architectural magnificence of the house, the genius of Alexander Jackson Davis, would outweigh the moral stain of Jay Good's money. She was betting that art was stronger than reputation. In 1961, Anna Good, the Duchess of Talleyrand-Périgord, passed away. She was 86 years old. She died in Paris, the city she loved, but her heart was in the grey stone tower on the Hudson. With her death, the private life of Lyndhurst ended. The gates that had been opened by Helen and closed by Anna were about to be locked by the lawyers. The dogs were gone. The servants were dismissed. The lights went out. The developers revved their bulldozers. The plan to demolish Lyndhurst was real. The land was too valuable. The house was too weird. It was a white elephant, a relic of bad taste and bad men. But the Duchess had signed the papers. In her will, she bequeathed Lyndhurst to the National Trust. It was a gift, but it was also a challenge. She handed them a 67-acre estate, a massive castle, and a century of baggage. She handed them the ghosts of the general, the merchant prince, the robber baron, the saint, and the Duchess. The question was no longer, who will live here? The question was, does this house deserve to be saved? The battle for the soul of Lyndhurst was over. The battle for its survival had just begun. The developers were at the gate, but the National Trust held the keys. And the ghost of Jay Good was watching, waiting to see if his fortress would stand or fall. In 1961, the United States was a nation obsessed with the future. John F. Kennedy was in the White House promising to put a man on the moon. The space age was in full swing. Architects were pouring concrete into massive, brutalist forms, and suburbanites were tearing down their Victorian porches to install picture windows and aluminium siding. The American aesthetic was defined by speed, glass, chrome, and light. In this neon-lit world, Lyndhurst was a corpse. When the Duchess of Talleyrand died, the estate went dark. It sat on the cliffs of Tarrytown like a rotting tooth in a perfect smile. To the developers of the 1960s, Lyndhurst wasn't a masterpiece. It was a waste of space. The 67 acres of prime riverfront land were worth millions. The real estate sharks looked at the map and didn't see a castle. They saw a subdivision. They saw 200 split-level ranch homes with two-car garages. They saw a shopping center. They saw progress. The threat of demolition was not theoretical. It was imminent. Across the Hudson Valley, the great estates were falling like dominoes. The wrecking balls were swinging daily, pulverizing the limestone fantasies of the Gilded Age into gravel to pave the new highways. The Tappan Zee Bridge had just opened nearby, turning the sleepy village of Tarrytown into a commuter hub. The pressure to develop was crushing. The will of Anna Good had left the property to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but a will is just a piece of paper. The Trust was a relatively young organization, and it was facing a crisis of identity. Until that moment, historic preservation in America meant saving the homes of founding fathers. It meant saving white clapboard farmhouses where patriots had slept, or Georgian brick mansions where treaties were signed. It was a patriotic enterprise. Lyndhurst was the opposite of patriotic. It was the home of Jay Goode, the man who had tried to break the United States government. It was a monument to greed, excess, and unbridled capitalism. Moreover, it was ugly. In the 1960s, Victorian Gothic architecture was considered the height of bad taste. It was viewed as creepy, dark, cluttered, and depressing. It was the architectural equivalent of a funeral. The board of the National Trust had a fierce debate. Why should they spend money to save the home of a villain? Why should they save a monstrosity when they could be saving a colonial battlefield? The developers whispered in their ears, "Just sell us the land. Keep the money. Let us knock down the spooky old castle." It came down to a razor-edge decision. The trust accepted the gift, but they did so with trepidation. They weren't sure if they were saving a national treasure or inheriting a national embarrassment. They took the keys, unlocked the heavy iron gates, and stepped into the gloom. What the curators found inside was shocking. Usually, when a house passes through 3 generations, it is modernized. Kitchens are updated, bathrooms are renovated, furniture is replaced. But Lyndhurst was a freak of preservation. Because Helen Good had worshipped her father, and because Anna Good had been living in exile in her own mind, the house was a perfect, hermetically sealed time capsule. Entering Lyndhurst in the early 1960s was like breaking into a pharaoh's tomb. The air was stale, smelling of old wax, dry rot, and the faint, lingering scent of Anna's Pekingese dogs. The curators found that the house was virtually unchanged since the 1880s. The bathrooms were ancient. The plumbing was a museum exhibit of Victorian engineering. The kitchens still had the massive, coal-fired cast-iron stoves that required a team of servants to operate. There were no sleek mid-century refrigerators here. There were ice boxes. But the sheer volume of stuff was the real problem. Anna Good had treated Lyndhurst like a storage locker for her European shopping spree. The curators opened closets and found Louis Vuitton steamer trunks that hadn't been unpacked since 1910. They found drawers stuffed with Tiffany silver. They found wardrobes filled with the Worth couture gowns of the Gilded Age, the silk shattering at the touch. They found the remnants of Jay Goode's life, perfectly preserved by Helen. His desk was still organized. His books were on the shelves. It was a psychological profile of a family that couldn't let go of anything. For the historians, it was a gold mine. For the archivists, it was a nightmare. They had to catalogue thousands of objects, from priceless paintings by Courbet to the mundane hairbrushes of the Duchess. They had to figure out how to turn a dark, cluttered private home into a public museum without destroying the atmosphere that made it special. They realized that the ugliness of the house, the darkness, the shadows, the crowded rooms, was actually its superpower. It wasn't a sterilized museum, it was a mood. As the National Trust prepared to open the house to the public in 1965, they found themselves fighting a culture war. The architectural critics of the New York Times and the sophisticated magazines scoffed at the project. They called Lyndhurst a mausoleum of bad taste. They couldn't understand why anyone would want to visit a gloomy pile of rocks when they could be visiting the Guggenheim. But the 1960s were also a time of counterculture. Under the surface of the shiny, happy space age, there was a growing fascination with the macabre, the weird, and the romantic. The generation that was tired of sterile glass boxes was looking for something with a soul, even if that soul was dark. When the doors finally opened, the public didn't recoil. They were mesmerized. They walked into the great hall, looked up at the vaulted ceilings, and felt the crush of history. They saw the lifestyle of the robber barons not as a history lesson, but as a fantasy. It was Game of Thrones before television. It was a window into a world of impossible wealth and dramatic sadness. The tour guides didn't hide the reputation of Jay Good. They leaned into it. They told the stories of the tunnels, the secret meetings, and the Mephistopheles pacing the halls at night. They realized that villainy sells tickets. People didn't come to see a hero's house. They came to see the lair of the dragon. Then, in 1970, something happened that cemented Lyndhurst's place in the American imagination forever. It didn't come from a historian, and it didn't come from a preservationist. It came from a vampire. Dan Curtis, the creator of the hit Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows, was looking for a location. He was making a feature film, House of Dark Shadows, and he needed a house that screamed vampire. He needed a structure that looked menacing, ancient, and undeniably spooky. He scouted locations all over the East Coast, but when he pulled up the driveway of Lyndhurst and saw the jagged silhouette of the tower cutting against the grey sky, he knew he had found Collinwood. The National Trust, usually protective and stuffy, took a gamble. They allowed the film crew in. Lyndhurst was transformed into the home of Barnabas Collins. The cameras rolled in the library where Jay Good had read to his children. The vampire stalked through the greenhouse where George Merritt had grown his orchids. The great stone porch became the site of Gothic melodrama. The film was a hit, and suddenly Lyndhurst wasn't just a museum, it was a pop culture icon. Millions of Americans who had never heard of Alexander Jackson Davis or Jay Good saw the movie and recognized the house. It became the archetype of the haunted mansion. It shaped the way we think a scary house should look. If you look at the haunted house in Disneyland, or the set design of practically every horror movie since 1970, you see traces of Lyndhurst. The steep roofs, the iron cresting, the narrow windows. It became the visual language of fear. This Hollywood connection saved the house financially. It brought a new wave of tourists who didn't care about architecture but wanted to see where the vampire lived. It made the house cool in a way that George Washington's house could never be. It proved that the weird, the dark, and the folly had a permanent place in the American psyche. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the tide of architectural taste turned again. The brutalism of the 60s fell out of favor. The postmodern movement arrived, and suddenly, history was back in style. People began to appreciate the craftsmanship of the Gilded Age. They looked at the hand-carved limestone of Lyndhurst and realized that we simply don't know how to build like that anymore. The National Trust began a massive, decades-long restoration project, but they made a brilliant choice. They didn't restore the house to one specific year. They didn't strip away the Duchess's French furniture to reveal the General's villa. They decided to preserve the layers. When you walk through Lyndhurst today, you are walking through a collage of time. You see the dining room set for dinner in the 1940s. You see the bedroom set for the 1870s. You see the layers of paint, the scuff marks of history. They kept the melancholy. They resisted the urge to brighten it up. They kept the shadows. But the true victory of Act 7 was the survival of the land. As you stand on the veranda today and look out over the Hudson River, you realize what almost happened. The view is pristine. The rolling lawns tumble down to the water, framed by massive linden trees that are now over a century old. If the developers had won in 1961, that view would be a parking lot. The silence of the estate would be the roar of lawnmowers and traffic. The fact that Lyndhurst exists is a miracle of stubbornness. It survived because William Paulding didn't care what his neighbors thought. It survived because Jay Good needed a fortress. It survived because Helen Good wouldn't change a chair. And it survived because Anna Good refused to let the modern world in. By the end of the 20th century, Lyndhurst had completed its journey. It started as a folly, became a palace, turned into a fortress, decayed into a white elephant, and emerged as a survivor. The corpse on the Hudson had come back to life. But the story wasn't quite over. The house was safe, but the landscape was changing. The 21st century would bring new challenges: climate change, the decay of the massive greenhouse, and the need to tell the stories not just of the goods, but of the servants, the slaves, and the prisoners who built the walls. The house had one final act to play: the reckoning with its own creation. The monster on the Hudson was awake, and it was ready to tell the truth. By the dawn of the 21st century, the stone castle of Lyndhurst was secure. The roof was tight, the foundation was solid, and the rooms were filled with tourists marveling at the Duchess's diamonds. But out on the lawn, a quarter-mile away from the main house, a giant was dying. The Lord and Burnham greenhouse, once the largest private conservatory in the Americas, had become a frightening skeleton. This was the structure that George Merritt had built to conquer winter. It was the cathedral where Jay Gould had worshipped his orchids. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a delicate lace of iron and glass that defied gravity. But glass is not stone. Glass breaks. Iron rusts. And for decades, the great greenhouse had been slowly dissolving into the earth. To understand the tragedy of this ruin, you have to understand what it represented. In 1881, this building was more technologically advanced than the house itself. It was a machine for living. It required over 100 tons of coal a year to heat. It had a dedicated boiler room that looked like the engine room of a battleship. It was a symbol of man's total dominance over nature. But by the year 2000, it was a ghost. The massive onion dome, which had once glittered in the sun like a Russian palace, was stripped of its glass to prevent shards from falling on visitors. The iron ribs stood exposed to the rain and snow, rusting into a deep, jagged orange. Vines crawled up the framework, strangling the metal. It looked less like a building and more like the ribcage of a leviathan that had washed ashore on the Hudson. For the preservationists at the National Trust, the greenhouse was a nightmare. The cost to restore it was astronomical, millions upon millions of dollars. There is no manual for fixing a 19th century glass palace. You cannot go to Home Depot and buy the parts. Every curved pane of glass, every iron rivet, every wooden mullion had to be custom made. For years the debate raged: let it fall or save it. It sat there as a stabilized ruin, a romantic term for a wreck. It was a stark reminder that the Gilded Age wasn't just built on money, it was built on maintenance. And without the infinite wealth of a robber baron, the maintenance had stopped. But Lyndhurst has a habit of finding saviors. Just as Merritt saved it from Paulding and Good saved it from Merritt, the modern era brought a new wave of philanthropy. The decision was made. The skeleton would rise again. The restoration of the greenhouse was an archaeological dig in reverse. As workers stripped away the layers of rot, they found the secrets of the Victorian gardeners. They found the intricate system of gears and levers that allowed a single man to open hundreds of windows simultaneously to ventilate the heat. They found the underground cisterns that collected rainwater. They realized that this wasn't just a pretty building, it was a precision instrument. The process was grueling. The iron had to be sandblasted, treated, and repainted its original white. Thousands of panes of glass were hand-cut. When the skin was finally put back on the bones, the transformation was spiritual. When you walk into the restored greenhouse today, the light hits you first. It is a blinding, diffuse white light that seems to come from everywhere at once. The air is still and warm. It feels like stepping inside a diamond. After decades of being a dark, rusting eyesore, the structure is once again a temple of light. It stands as a testament to the idea that we can reverse entropy, that we can pull history back from the brink of oblivion if we care enough to pay the bill. While the greenhouse restoration captured the public's imagination with its beauty, a different kind of excavation was happening inside the castle. For 100 years, the story of Lyndhurst had been the story of the owners, the general, the tycoon, the saint, and the duchess. But a house of this size does not run on magic. It runs on labor. Historians began to look away from the gold leaf ceilings and look down, into the basement, into the laundry building, and into the servants' quarters. They began to uncover the story of the invisible army. Lyndhurst was designed to hide the people who made it work. Alexander Jackson Davis, the architect, used trompe l'oeil and hidden passages to ensure that the guests never had to see a maid carrying a bucket. The architecture was complicit in a social lie. That luxury is effortless. But the basement tells the truth. If you go down into the bowels of the house, you see the infrastructure of servitude. You see the massive coal chutes where men shoveled fuel until their lungs were black, just to keep the Duchess warm in her library. You see the bell board, a complex grid of wires and bells that connected every room in the house to the kitchen. When Jay Good rang a bell in his bedroom at 3:00 a.m. because of his insomnia, a servant in the basement had to wake up, dress, and sprint up 3 flights of stairs in seconds. The investigation into the staff revealed a microcosm of American immigration. In the 1840s, the staff was largely Irish, refugees from the famine, desperate for work, taking jobs that native-born Americans refused. By the 1880s, the staff included Germans, Swedes, and Italians. Lyndhurst was a melting pot, simmering in the basement while the WASP elite dined upstairs. The laundry building, a separate structure near the stables, is perhaps the most poignant sight on the estate. Today, laundry is a chore. In 1880, it was an industrial process. The laundresses of Lyndhurst worked in a steam-filled purgatory. They scrubbed the heavy linen sheets, the petticoats, and the tablecloths by hand. They used irons that weighed 10 pounds, heated on coal stoves. They worked 12-hour days in sweltering heat. And yet, for many of them, Lyndhurst was a good job. The goods paid better than the factories. They provided housing. They provided food. Helen Good, the saint, even provided education. The relationship between the upstairs and downstairs was not the cartoon villainy of Downton Abbey. It was complex. It was a feudal contract. You give us your life, and we will give you security. The restoration also revealed that Lyndhurst was a technological marvel disguised as a medieval relic. We tend to think of old houses as primitive, but Jay Good was a man of the future. He didn't just buy art, he bought tech. The house was one of the first in the valley to have electricity. Imagine the shock of the neighbors in the 1880s, looking up at the dark bluff and seeing the castle suddenly blaze with electric light. It must have looked like sorcery. But the most fascinating discovery was the air conditioning. Long before Carrier invented the modern AC unit, the architects of Lyndhurst had engineered a passive cooling system. The great tower wasn't just for show, it was a chimney. In the summer, the staff would open the windows in the tower and the windows in the basement. The hot air would rise up the tower, creating a vacuum that pulled cool air from the basement up through the house. It was a giant lung. The house breathed. They found gas pipes hidden inside the intricate wood carvings. They found speaking tubes, an early intercom system buried in the walls. The fantasy of the Middle Ages was sustained by the cutting-edge engineering of the Industrial Revolution. It was a cyborg house, ancient stone on the outside, modern machine on the inside. As the 21st century progressed, the view from the veranda began to change. For 150 years, the view from Lyndhurst had been the Hudson River, the trains, and the distant Palisades. It was a view of nature and commerce. But the modern world began to intrude in a new way. The Tappan Zee Bridge, a crumbling relic of the 1950s, was replaced by the massive Mario Cuomo Bridge. The skyline of the Hudson Valley was transforming. And yet, Lyndhurst held its ground. The estate became a crucial green lung in a suffocating suburbia. As developers paved over the rest of Westchester County, the 67 acres of Lyndhurst became a sanctuary for wildlife. Bald eagles, once extinct in the area, returned to nest in the trees George Merritt had planted. Foxes and coyotes roamed the grounds at night. The house began to take on a new role. It wasn't just a museum of the Gilded Age. It was a witness to environmental change. The river rising due to climate change began to threaten the lower boathouse. The storms became more violent, testing the slate roof that had held for a century. The preservationists realized that their job wasn't just to save the rugs, it was to save the land itself. In the last decade, the storytelling at Lyndhurst shifted. The tour guides stopped talking exclusively about the wealth of the goods. They started talking about the source of that wealth. They began to discuss the darker side of Jay Good's empire, the labor strikes he crushed, the monopolies he built, the sheer ruthlessness of the capital that bought the limestone. They stopped hiding the fact that this beautiful object was bought with blood money. They also began to tell the story of the women. For too long, the narrative had been about the men, Paulding, Davis, Merritt, Good. But the house was truly shaped by the women. Helen, who saved it with her stubbornness. Anna, who filled it with her sorrow and her treasure, and the countless unnamed maids who polished the floors. Lyndhurst became a place to discuss the American dream in all its complexity. It is a house built by a general who wanted peace, expanded by a merchant who wanted status, and inhabited by a tycoon who wanted power. It is a house saved by a daughter who wanted redemption. And then the cameras returned. In a stroke of poetic justice, HBO chose Lyndhurst as a primary filming location for the series Asterisk, the Gilded Age Asterisk. Once again, the house was dressed up. The actors put on the corsets and the top hats. The gravel drive was covered in dirt to hide the asphalt. But this time, it felt different than the vampire movie of the 1970s. This wasn't a caricature. The show was trying to depict the era exactly as it was, beautiful, cruel, and obsessed with status. Lyndhurst didn't have to act. It just had to be itself. When you see the house on screen now, gleaming in high definition, you are seeing the ultimate victory of Alexander Jackson Davis. He built a house to be a picture, a piece of theatre. And nearly 2 centuries later, it is still the most compelling set piece in America. As Act 7 closes, we are left with a paradox. The house is more open than ever. You can buy a ticket online. You can take a yoga class on the lawn. You can watch a movie in the carriage house. The exclusivity of the goods is gone. But when the sun goes down and the tourists leave and the gates are locked, the house reclaims its power. The invisible army is gone. The boiler room is silent. The Duchess is dead. And yet the house feels like it is waiting. It has survived the Civil War, the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, and the Wrecking Ball. It has outlived every person who ever thought they owned it. It sits on the dark bluff, staring out at the river with its narrow, glowing eyes, a stone monster that has learned to be a pet. The restoration is complete. The glass cathedral is risen. The secrets of the basement are exposed. But there is one final chapter left to tell. The legacy. What does a castle mean in a democracy? And as we look toward the future, will Lyndhurst continue to stand, or will the rising tides of history finally wash the grey fortress into the river? The manor files are nearly closed. The final judgment awaits. The sun sets early over the Hudson River in late autumn. As the light fades, the grey limestone of Lyndhurst begins to perform its final trick of the day. It absorbs the shadows. The sharp angles of the turrets blur into the twilight, and the house transforms from a solid structure of the 19th century into a silhouette of something far older, something primal. We have traced this house through 180 years of American history. We watched it rise as a folly, mocked by neighbors who wanted white columns and order. We watched it expand into a palace for a merchant prince who tried to tame the winter with glass. We saw it bought by the devil, redeemed by a saint, and ruled by a duchess. We watched it die, rot, and miraculously rise from the grave to become a star of cinema and a sanctuary of history. But as we close the file on Lyndhurst, we are left with a lingering question. What is this place? Is it a monument to the genius of Alexander Jackson Davis? Is it a crime scene where the loot of the robber barons is stored? Or is it something else entirely? Time has a way of performing alchemy on reputation. When Jay Good lived here, this house was a fortress of fear. It was the lair of the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. If you walked past the gates in 1890, you didn't feel awe, you felt anger. You felt the weight of the monopolies, the crushed strikes, and the rigged markets. But walk past the gates today, and the anger is gone. Time has scrubbed the blood from the money. We no longer see the ruthlessness of the Gilded Age. We see the romance. We look at the Tiffany glass and the Herter Brothers furniture, and we don't think about the labor that paid for it. We think about the beauty. Lyndhurst proves a cynical truth about history. If you build something beautiful enough, and if it stands long enough, the world will eventually forgive you. Architecture, it seems, is the ultimate money laundering scheme. However, the survival of Lyndhurst is not a guarantee, it is a daily war. A house of this magnitude does not want to stand. Gravity, water, and wind are constantly conspiring to pull it down. The National Trust is not just a curator, it is a general in a forever war against entropy. The slate roof, made of heavy, hand-cut stones, weighs hundreds of tons. It presses down on timber beams that have been holding their breath since 1838. Every winter, the freeze-thaw cycle tries to crack the mortar in the Sing Sing marble. Every summer, the humidity of the river valley tries to rot the velvet drapes of the Duchess. The cost of this war is staggering. To restore a single window can cost thousands of dollars. To repoint the masonry of the tower costs millions. This is the white elephant reality that terrified the post foundation at Mar-a-Lago and doomed so many other estates. Lyndhurst survives only because it has become a master of disguise. It pays its bills by selling its soul in the best possible way. It rents itself out for weddings, where brides pay a fortune to feel like Anna Good for a night. It hosts craft fairs on the lawn. It becomes a movie set for HBO. It allows itself to be commercialized so that it can remain sacred. It is a hustle that Jay Good would have appreciated. The house is earning its keep. But no matter how many tourists walk through the halls, the house never feels fully public. There is a density to the air inside Lyndhurst that you don't find in other museums. It is the weight of personality. Most historic homes are emptied out, sanitized and staged. Lyndhurst is crowded. It is cluttered with the debris of 3 families who refuse to throw anything away. When you stand in the library, you are looking at the same books Jay Good read to his children. You are looking at the chair where he sat, staring into the fire, worrying about the district attorney. The ghost of Lyndhurst isn't a sheet-wearing phantom that rattles chains. The ghost is the architecture itself. Alexander Jackson Davis designed this house to manipulate your emotions. He lowered the ceilings in the hallways to make you feel compressed, then vaulted them in the rooms to make you feel released. He narrowed the windows to focus your gaze. He painted the shadows onto the walls. The house is a psychological machine that is still running. When you are inside, you feel smaller. You feel watched. You feel the melancholy that the romantics prized so highly. It forces you to slow down and consider your own insignificance against the scale of stone and time. The house dictates how you feel. It is the dominant organism. We are just the temporary bacteria passing through its gut. As we look to the future, Lyndhurst faces a threat that Jay Good could never have leveraged and that the Duchess could not have snubbed. The climate is changing. The house sits on a bluff, safe from the tides, but the landscape is vulnerable. The storms coming up the Atlantic coast are getting stronger. The winds that batter the greenhouse are fiercer. The monster on the Hudson was built to withstand the 19th century, but the 21st century is bringing a different kind of violence. The estate has become a sentinel. The linden trees that George Merritt planted are reaching the end of their biological lifespans. The landscape architects are now asking difficult questions. Do we replant the same trees, knowing the climate has warmed? Or do we plant new species that can survive the heat of the future? Do we preserve the past, or do we adapt for survival? Lyndhurst is becoming a laboratory for these questions. It is no longer just preserving a house. It is preserving the idea of permanence in a world that is increasingly temporary. So, what is the legacy of Lyndhurst? It is the story of the American dream in all its dark and glittering complexity. It tells us that you can start as a mayor, become a general, sell to a tycoon, and end up as a duchess. It tells us that you can be the most hated man in the world, but if you love your children and build a strong enough castle, your name will survive. It tells us that beauty is not moral. A house can be beautiful even if it was built by a monster. In fact, perhaps it requires a certain kind of monstrous ambition to build something this enduring. It takes an ego the size of the Hudson River to stack limestone toward the clouds and say, "I will live here forever." As night finally claims the valley, the lights inside the castle do not come on. It sits in darkness, a jagged black cut against the stars. The cars rush by on the highway below, the drivers glancing up for a second at the spooky old house on the hill, unaware of the dramas that played out in those rooms. Lyndhurst does not need their attention. It does not need their approval. It has outlived the critics who called it a folly. It has outlived the bankers who called it an asset. It has outlived the family who called it home. It is the corpse that refused to die. It is the Gothic heart of America, still beating, slow and steady, under a ribcage of Sing Sing marble. It waits on the hill, watching the river flow south to the city, indifferent to the passage of time, guarding its secrets in the shadows. The gates may be locked, but the file is never truly closed, because as long as the stone stands, the story continues. I'm your host, Lewis, and these have been the Manor Files.